Okay, lesson 31, getting and using the right to vote. Here we see some old-fashioned voting booths. So suffrage. Suffrage means the legal right to vote. The early republic limited suffrage mainly to property-holding white males. Suffrage was extended to most white males when they got rid of the property qualifications in the Jacksonian period, which was the early 1800s. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 would guarantee African Americans the right to vote. However, full implementation really didn't occur for another century, so it was there on paper, but it really didn't seem to take much effect. States found various ways to circumvent or ignore the 15th Amendment, work around it. Circumvent basically means work around. And examples are the grandfather clause, the poll tax, the white primary, and the literacy test, or as is kind of more accurate to say, the voter registration test. So the grandfather clause, this exempted people whose grandfathers were eligible to vote in 1860 from taking literacy tests in order to vote. Now, this exemption obviously could not be applied to the grandchildren of slaves. So this meant that white folks could be exempted from literacy tests, whereas African Americans in the South could not be exempted from literacy tests. This was declared unconstitutional in Gwynn versus the United States in 1915. Poll taxes. They're small taxes that are required in order for you to vote. And poll taxes were kind of often set up to be due about the time of year when sharecroppers would have the least amount of cash available, when they needed their money to be spent on other things, and when there was no harvest in and lean times. So the real purpose, of course, to a poll tax is to keep poor African Americans from being able to vote. The white primary. This permitted political parties in the heavily Democratic South to exclude African Americans from primary elections. The pretext for this was that parties or primaries were private, not public institutions. So this would deprive blacks of a voice in the primaries where the real contest occurred, because Republicans in the South at that time really didn't have much of a chance at all of winning an election. These white primaries were declared unconstitutional in Smith versus Allwright in 1944. So not that long ago, when it comes right down to it. There are plenty of people walking around in this country right now who were alive and kicking when white primaries were okay. Voter registration tests or literacy tests. Many areas in the South use these voter registration tests. Some of these tests were checked for an understanding of the Constitution. They were often used in a discriminatory manner. In other words, there may be more than one test to give, and they might give an easy test to a white guy who walks up and then a hard test for an African American. If you look at this political cartoon kind of making fun of the idea of these voter registration tests, you see that the guy who's writing the sign down doesn't spell very well. So if you work it out, it says something like education qualification. The black man ought to be educated, but it says the black man order be educated before he can vote with us whites. This Mr. Solid South. And of course, there's tons of grammatical issues and misspellings in the sign. The Civil Rights Movement put suffrage high on its political agenda, and many barriers to African American voting would fall during the 1960s. So poll taxes would get knocked down. Poll taxes in federal elections would be prohibited by the 24th Amendment in 1964. Poll taxes in state elections were invalidated 2 years later in Harper versus Virginia State Board of Elections. So there are two things to remember, two official government actions that need to be associated with poll taxes, which is for the federal elections, 24th Amendment, for state elections, Harper versus Virginia. And here we see an example of someone's receipt for filling out their poll tax. So the key to voting rights really is, this is huge, is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It prohibited any government from using voting procedures that denied a person the vote on the basis of race or color. Federal election registrars would be sent to areas that had long histories of discrimination, and as a result, many African Americans were registered in southern states as, you know, and basically, guys, this is they just sent federal agents down there, federal bureaucrats, to make sure people were allowed to be registered. That's essentially what they did. And the Voting Rights Act produced a major increase in the number of African Americans who registered to vote in the South, and also in the number of African Americans who were elected to public office. This is a very big deal. And the Voting Rights Act has been renewed many times. There's the Voting Rights Act in 1967, and so on and so on, and a number of Voting Rights Acts. The civil rights laws that African American groups push for have also benefited other minority groups, such as American Indians or Native Americans, Asians, and Hispanics. The United States is heading toward, this is something the book talks about, the United States is heading toward a minority majority status, where minority groups will outnumber Caucasians of European descent. And so the Caucasians will be the largest minority, but there won't really be a majority. Remember that term I used called a plurality, the greatest number when there is no majority? That's what the Caucasians in this country will eventually be. Native Americans. The oldest minority group in America are Native Americans, but they were not made U.S. citizens until 1924. And a key to understanding Native American rights and issues, the Indian Claims Act was enacted in 1946 to settle financial disputes arising from land taken from Native Americans. And here we see a picture kind of showing you how there was plenty of racism back in the day toward Native Americans. If you look closely, there's a sign up there that says, positively no beer sold to Indians. Hispanic Americans, they have displaced African Americans as the largest minority group. Your textbook reported, I believe, that they were about to. They have. They have displaced African Americans as the largest minority group. They're both slightly under 13%. I believe Hispanic Americans are at 12.9%, and African Americans are at 12.3% of the overall population. That was with the 2000 census. I haven't seen the data on the 2010 census. And this could be kind of confusing to people who live here because we have a larger African American population than quite a few other states have. So it may be hard for you guys to grasp the idea that the African American population in the United States only constitutes something close to 12 to 13% of the population. Here we see a couple of successful Hispanic Americans, a Supreme Court Justice, Sotomayor, and then the guy down there is a lieutenant general, and very important in our operations in the Middle East, in Iraq. Asian Americans. They are the fastest growing minority group. During World War II, the U.S. government rounded up more than 100,000 Americans of Japanese descent and placed them in internment encampments, or internment camps, known as war relocation centers. The Supreme Court upheld the internment as constitutional in Korematsu versus the United States. This old gentleman here is Korematsu. But Congress later provided benefits for the former internees, which still have not been distributed. So There you go. Korematsu versus the United States. It's still considered constitutional law and precedent. It was established in 1944. I would suspect if the issue came up again before the Supreme Court, and it won't, that they would overthrow Korematsu versus the United States.